He thought he'd won it all in the divorce, the penthouse, the empire, her silence. But when his wife's family lawyer entered the courtroom, his brutal victory evaporated, and he realized he hadn't been fighting his wife. He'd been provoking a dynasty. The air in the 27th floor courtroom was a sterile blend of recycled coolness and polished mahogany. Sunlight, sharp and impersonal, cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing over the silent, tense tableau. At the heart of it, Liam Thorne allowed a smile, not of joy, but of cold, vindicated satisfaction, to touch his lips. It was a gesture he'd perfected in boardrooms, and it fit here just as well. This, after all, was simply another hostile takeover. Across the expanse of carved oak, his wife, Evelyn, sat with a stillness that he'd long mistaken for docility. Her posture was perfect, her hands folded on the gleaming table surface. To Liam, she looked like a beautiful statue, a final piece of art to be appraised and removed from the premises. A trophy wife, he thought, the old, private term surfacing with finality. And today, I'm cashing her in. For 18 months, this divorce had been his masterwork, a brutal strategic campaign waged not with shouts, but with subpoenas, forensic accountants, and loopholes buried deep within prenuptial addendums. He was a venture capitalist by trade, a man who built fortunes by identifying weak assets and leveraging them to the brink. He realized with a thrill that was almost intellectual, applied the same principles to his marriage. The court, intoned Judge Miriam Carter, her voice echoing slightly in the hushed room, finds the division of marital assets as presented by petitioner's counsel to be compelling and substantiated by the evidence. Liam's lead attorney, Richard Vance, gave an almost imperceptible nod. Vance was a shark in a Brioni suit, his fees astronomical and his reputation built on leaving opponents financially eviscerated. Together, they had meticulously dismantled the narrative of a shared life. They had reframed the Soho penthouse, the one Evelyn had painstakingly renovated, filling it with light and art, as an investment property, acquired primarily with capital from Liam's early pre-marriage successes. They had presented the liquidity, the stocks and bonds, as fruits of his relentless deal-making, portraying Evelyn's role as merely social, a hostess for the parties where hands were shaken and fortunes made. But the masterstroke was Sylvan, the eco-luxury home goods company. Evelyn had conceived it during a trip to Costa Rica, sketching the first designs for biodegradable tableware on a napkin. Liam had provided the initial seed funding, a fact his team documented exhaustively, and then crucially had stepped back to let her run it. In court, Vance painted this not as spousal support, but as a high-risk investment by a patient principal. He presented spreadsheets showing Liam's capital injections, but conveniently glossed over Evelyn's 80-hour weeks, her patented designs, her curation of the brand soul that had turned it into a cult favorite with a 9-figure valuation. With regard to Sylvan Enterprises LLC, Judge Carter continued, adjusting her glasses, the court recognizes the petitioner's demonstrable financial contribution as foundational. Ownership and operational control are hereby awarded to Mr. Thorne, with a one-time compensatory settlement to be paid to Ms. Thorne, the details of which will be finalized in the subsequent financial order. A one-time payout. A severance package for a CEO he was ousting from her own life's work. Liam's gaze drifted back to Evelyn. He searched for the crack, a tremor in her hand, a sheen of tears in her wide hazel eyes. There was nothing. Only that profound, unsettling stillness. For a fleeting second, it unnerved him. He remembered that stillness from years ago, the first time he'd seen her at a gallery opening, a calm center in a swirling storm of noise. He'd found it intriguing then. Later, he'd found it inert. He'd mistaken her quiet observation for passivity, her thoughtful silences for a lack of something to say. He'd believed his own narrative, that he was the dynamo, the creator, and she was the lovely, static complement. She has nothing, he reassured himself. Her lawyer, a competent but clearly outmatched man named Alan Finch, had put up a valiant, sentimental fight. He'd spoken of partnership, of intangible contributions, of shared dreams. It was touching. And in this room, as worthless as paper confetti, Finch was already closing his binder, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Liam's mind was already racing ahead, past the formalities. The penthouse would go on the market, Its cold, new minimalist staging, his preference, would appeal to foreign investors. Sylvan, he'd probably sell it to a conglomerate within the year. A tidy profit. He envisioned his new life, unencumbered, a sleek apartment uptown, freedom. Evelyn would fade into a memory, a closed chapter, a lesson learned. The matters of spousal support and the final valuation adjustment will be scheduled for a follow-up hearing, Judge Carter said, reaching for her gavel. But the core asset division, as ruled today, stands. This was the moment. The final decisive crack of sound that would make it all real. Richard Vance allowed himself a small tight smile of professional triumph. Liam leaned back in the plush leather chair, the smug certainty settling in his bones. He had played the ultimate corporate game and won. He had leveraged every advantage, parsed every emotion into a liability or a weakness, and emerged with the prize, everything. The judge raised the polished walnut gavel. The room held its breath. For Liam Thorne, it was the pinnacle of a clean, brutal, and perfectly executed victory. He did not look at Evelyn again. There was no need. The story, as he had written it, was over. The gavel began its descent. The sound of the descending gavel was swallowed, not by impact, but by a smooth metallic click. It was the sound of the courtroom's double doors being opened from the hallway outside, precise and authoritative. Judge Carter's arm halted, the gavel hovering an inch above its sound block. Every head in the room, the board clerk, the two junior associates on Liam's team already thinking of lunch, the court reporter, snapped toward the entrance. It was a breach of protocol, a jarring interruption in a ceremony they all believed was concluded. Liam's triumphant exhale caught in his throat. He watched bewildered, as his wife's attorney, Alan Finch, did not react with surprise. Instead, the man who had moments ago seemed deflated simply straightened his tie, closed his binder with a definitive thump, and gave a single solemn nod toward the back. It wasn't a gesture of defeat. It was a signal. She entered alone. A woman in her late 40s, moving with an economy of motion that commanded the vast space. Her suit was a deep, inky navy, so impeccably tailored it seemed carved from stone, the sharp lines accentuating a form that was both elegant and formidable. Her heels, dark leather, made no sound on the polished floor. She carried a slim obsidian leather folio, and her gaze swept the room once, not seeking permission, but assessing terrain. Her hair, a sweep of dark silver-streaked chestnut, was pulled into a severe, perfect knot. Her face was unreadable, a mask of composed intelligence. A low murmur started among Liam's associates, quickly silenced by a sharp look from Richard Vance. Vance, who knew every player in the legal world, felt the first cold trickle of unease. He didn't recognize her face from the usual New York circuit. This was different. The woman walked past the public gallery, past Liam's table without a glance, as if they were furniture. She stopped before the bench, placing her folio gently on Alan Finch's table. Finch, with a deference Vance had never seen the man show, immediately yielded his chair, stepping back as a lieutenant would for a general. "Your Honor," the woman said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a crystalline clarity, a resonance that filled the silent room. It was a voice accustomed to being heard in the most rarefied of boardrooms and the most secretive of chambers. "Apologies for the interruption. I am Eleanor Vance Ross of Vance Ross and Lockhart." The name landed in the hushed room with the weight of a lead curtain. Vance Ross and Lockhart. It wasn't just a law firm, it was a fortress, a legend whispered in the corridors of finance and old money power. They didn't advertise. They didn't handle high-profile celebrity divorces for the press. They represented dynasties. They were the retainers for families whose names were on university libraries and hospital wings, families who settled their most sensitive matters in absolute silence, far from public dockets. Richard Vance felt his blood run cold. Ross. He'd heard rumors. The firm's family assets division was mythic. They didn't fight for alimony. They engaged in forensic archaeology to trace and protect generational wealth from interlopers and fortune hunters. Eleanor Vance Ross continued, her eyes fixed on Judge Carter, who had slowly lowered her gavel, her expression one of intrigued caution. "I have just been formally retained as lead counsel for the respondent, Evelyn Thorne, née Evelyn Lockwood." Lockwood. For Liam, The name was a key turning in a lock he never knew existed. Lockwood. It was a name Evelyn had rarely used, a name she'd said belonged to a quiet academic family in Connecticut. A harmless, genteel background he'd never bothered to investigate. The pieces, sharp and terrifying, began to click together in his mind. The Lockwoods weren't just academics, they were the kind whose academic endowments could buy entire universities. "We move for an immediate stay of today's judgment," Eleanor stated, not asking but informing. "And we move to set it aside on grounds of fraud upon the court, material misrepresentation, and the introduction of newly discovered evidence that fundamentally alters the equitable landscape of this proceeding." Richard Vance was on his feet, instinct taking over. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Counsel's timing is a transparent theatric stunt to delay the implementation of a lawful order. Mr. Finch has represented the respondent for the entirety." "Mr. Finch," Eleanor interrupted, without even looking at him, "was retained as local counsel to handle preliminary filings, upon my instruction, while our firm conducted its investigation. That investigation is now complete." Her glance at Finch was brief. He nodded once, confirmation. It hadn't been a defeat, it had been a holding pattern. She opened her folio, withdrawing a single, creamy sheet of parchment. "This is a notice of substitution of counsel, signed by the respondent, and a motion to vacate, supported by a preliminary affidavit from our forensic accounting team." She handed it to the stunned bailiff, who carried it to the judge. "The evidence presented to this court regarding the capital structure of Sylvan Enterprises, and indeed of the majority of assets claimed as marital, is demonstrably false. The seed funding did not originate from Mr. Thorne's premarital portfolio. It was drawn through a series of deliberately obscured trusts, from the Augusta Lockwood Irrevocable Trust, of which my client is the sole lifetime beneficiary." She let that hang in the air. The Augusta Lockwood Trust. It sounded like an institution. "Furthermore," Eleanor continued, her tone still calm, almost conversational, as if discussing the weather, "we have evidence of dissipation of marital assets by the petitioner in anticipation of divorce, and of a concerted campaign to devalue the true intellectual property, the patents, trademarks and brand equity, held by my client. What was presented as a division was, in fact, a liquidation." She finally turned her head, just enough to let her gaze, cool and assessing, fall upon Liam. It was not a look of anger or gloating. It was the look a master chess player gives a piece they are about to remove from the board. The game, her eyes seemed to say, has not been played. It has just been learned. The quiet in the room was no longer tense with anticipation of an ending. It was thick with the shock of a beginning. The polished victory of moments ago had not been overturned, it had been revealed as a facade, a stage set built on sand. Liam's smug smile was a ghost on his face. He wasn't looking at Evelyn anymore. He was staring at the elegant, terrifying woman who had just rewritten the entire story with a few soft-spoken sentences. The power in the room hadn't shifted. It had simply revealed its true source, and it was sitting at the other table, with a stillness that was no longer passive, but profoundly, devastatingly potent. Eleanor Vance Ross did not raise her voice. She did not need to. In the tomb-like silence of the courtroom, her words were surgical instruments, each one making a precise, fatal incision into Liam Thorne's reality. "Your Honor, if we may proceed in camera for efficiency, I will outline the fundamental misrepresentations." At Judge Cotter's sharp nod, Eleanor signaled to the back. A young associate, as crisp and silent as her mentor, entered with a tablet and a portable printer. The 21st century arsenal had arrived. "Let us begin with Exhibit A, the Capitol Trail." An image was displayed on the court's monitor, a labyrinthine flowchart of accounts, wires, and holding companies. It was a map of concealed wealth, and at its center was the Augusta Lockwood Irrevocable Trust. The petitioner testified that the $2.5 million seed capital for Sylvan Enterprises originated from his Atlas Ventures fund, closed prior to the marriage. Her laser pointer, a dot of cool red, traced a path. "These records, subpoenaed this morning from the Bank of Liechtenstein, show that fund was a shell depleted. The capital was wired from a numbered account in Zurich, which is, as you see here, wholly owned by the Lockwood Trust. It was not a gift. It was a low-interest, recourse loan to the marital entity, with my client's intellectual property as collateral. Mr. Thorne didn't fund the dream, he mortgaged it, and has now attempted a foreclosure by fraud. Liam felt the mahogany table under his palm grow clammy. Richard Vance was scribbling frantic notes, his earlier confidence evaporated. This is newly fabricated, Vance began. The documents are time-stamped, notarized, and verified by the International Banking Consortium as of 1 hour ago, Eleanor stated, cutting him off without a glance. We move to Exhibit B, Dissipation of Assets. New statements appeared. In the 18 months preceding the filing, while publicly portraying a stable marriage, Mr. Thorne funneled $4.7 million into a private equity vehicle, Horizon Dawn, registered in the Cayman Islands and controlled by a corporate officer who is also his college roommate. This was not an investment. It was a conduit. Your own financial disclosures, Mr. Thorne, omitted this entirely. She then turned her focus to the penthouse. The claim that this was an investment property, acquired with premarital assets, is another fiction. The down payment was sourced from a joint money market account, but the provenance of those funds, she clicked, and another cascade of statements appeared. Traces back to the sale of a patent held by my client, a patent for a water filtration system she developed at MIT, filed in her name alone, and sold 6 months before the penthouse purchase. The capital was, and remains, hers. You have not been awarded an asset, Mr. Thorne. You have been caught attempting to steal one. The room was spinning for Liam. Each slide was a demolition charge, blowing apart the carefully constructed edifice of his case. He risked a glance at Evelyn. She was watching her attorney, a faint, almost sorrowful understanding in her eyes. Not triumph. Not yet. It was the look of someone witnessing an inevitable, long-overdue audit. Your Honor, Eleanor said, her tone shifting to one of grave consequence. This pattern establishes more than grounds for equitable reconsideration. It establishes a prima facie case of fraud upon this court and a systematic breach of fiduciary duty one spouse owes another under New York law. She paused, letting the legal terms hang, their dire implications settling over the room like a frost. Then she delivered the masterstroke. From her folio, she withdrew 2 thick, bound documents. She handed one to the bailiff for the judge. The other, she turned and placed deliberately on the table before Richard Vance. The sound of the heavy paper hitting the wood was a dull thunderclap. Concurrently with our motion to vacate, she announced, her voice now filling every corner of the chamber, we have this morning filed a civil complaint in New York Supreme Court. The Augusta Lockwood Irrevocable Trust, and Evelyn Lockwood Thorne, versus Liam J. Thorne and Horizon Dawn Capital Partners. The charges are fraud, fraudulent concealment, breach of fiduciary duty, and unjust enrichment. We are seeking full restitution of all misappropriated funds, treble damages under the statute, as well as a constructive trust over the petitioner's current personal and business assets, pending trial. The air left Liam's lungs. A separate lawsuit. This wasn't just about undoing the divorce judgment. This was about annihilating him financially. A constructive trust would freeze everything he had. Treble damages could wipe him out and leave him in debt. His reputation, his credit, his ability to move a single dollar, all would be paralyzed. Richard Vance was pale, flipping through the complaint. This is a vindictive fishing expedition. Your Honor, I move to. Your motions, Eleanor said, finally turning her full formidable attention to Vance and by extension to Liam, are now irrelevant to this new reality. The petition for divorce is no longer the primary action. It is a subordinate footnote to a prosecution for theft. She returned her gaze to the judge. We request an emergency hearing on our motion to vacate for next week. In the interim, we seek a full freeze on all assets subject to today's erroneous order, and an immediate injunction barring Mr. Thorne from transferring or encumbering any property worldwide. Judge Carter, who had watched this performance with a mix of astonishment and dawning severity, finally spoke. Given the extraordinary allegations and prima facie documentation presented, the court grants the stay. The judgment is suspended, pending the hearing. A temporary freeze and injunction are hereby ordered. Her gavel fell, but this time it was not an ending. It was a beginning. The first strike of a gavel in a war Liam now realized he could never win. In minutes, his victory had not merely evaporated, it had been revealed as a catastrophic provocation. He hadn't outmaneuvered a trophy wife. He had picked a lock on a vault he never knew existed, tripping a silent alarm that had summoned an empire. The reckoning was no longer a threat. It was a filed, docketed, and served reality. As Eleanor Vance Ross quietly gathered her papers, and Evelyn stood with a grace that now seemed like the calm of supreme power, Liam Thorne didn't just face the loss of a penthouse or a company. He faced the cold, meticulous unraveling of his entire life, brick by fraudulent brick, by an adversary who wasn't fighting for a settlement. She was enforcing a legacy. And she had only just begun. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe, like and share for more stories.